Welcome to Illuminati Silver. We tell you the truth about silver. Today is Wednesday, the 1st of May 2019, and we're broadcasting part 2 of a 3-part interview with hedge fund manager and owner broadcaster of Macro Voices, Mr. Erik Townsend. In part 1, we discussed Erik's views on the precious metals markets, currency markets, and how long he believes the US dollar will remain the world reserve currency, and what it may be replaced with. A link to that podcast is shown in the description section below this one. In this podcast, we shall be discussing precious metal pumpers and how to recognize one, how Erik sees long-term stagnation as a distinct possibility, and the potential replacement for the fractional reserve banking system. We also discuss gold and silver prices and ratios. So let's get on to it and enjoy. We love pumpers on this channel, and all our listeners know that we have a tremendous love-hate relationship with a few of them. But they point out, Erik, with some credence, they say, okay, World Gold Council announces that last year showed the highest central bank buying of gold in the last 50 years, for example. We're already seeing countries such as Russia getting rid of their dollar-denominated debt, China trying to get rid of theirs. They say this can't last for much longer. Now, you and us actually seem to agree on the sort of time frame-ish. But these pumpers are winning the hearts and minds and souls of certainly the small investor by pointing out these crisis points. How do you perhaps allay that fear, or should we even allay that fear and say, hang on, guys, don't put every single penny that you have into gold and silver tomorrow. This is a process that can be invested in over a period of time. Or what is the solution?
Well, I think it's important to realize a lot of those things that you just described are extremely valid points that deserve investors' attention for sure. But this is the classic signature of the precious metals pumpers is they'll hit you with a whole bunch of entirely legitimate, bona fide arguments. Look at central banks around the world. They see what's coming. They've got the best information. They are accumulating gold and silver. They're dumping their U.S. Treasury holdings. The evidence is immutably clear. Don't miss it. And then they without changing the tone of their delivery or letting you know they've shifted gears, they transition to a ridiculous claim. So therefore, it's absolutely certain that any day now, things are going to blow up. We're going to wake up one morning, the U.S. dollar has crashed, it's worth nothing, everybody has lost all of their value. And here are examples of real times in history in countries like Weimar Germany, or Argentina, or Venezuela, where there were no parallels whatsoever to the current conditions in the United States or the UK. But it sounds good, and it gets you into this mindset of, oh my God, the sky is falling. The thing to understand is the precious metals pumpers have been playing this same exact story with great success for 50 or 60 years now. And frankly, the arguments that they made 50 or 60 years ago, and it really started with the demonetization of gold on August 15th of 1971 when President Nixon essentially slammed the gold window and defaulted on the U.S. government's obligation to honor foreign conversions of U.S. dollars into gold at a fixed agreed rate of exchange of $35 an ounce, which is what the Bretton Woods Treaty was all about. At that point, they had absolutely compelling. It was worth listening to. It was worth taking seriously. They were right when they said that some kind of blow up of the financial system is inevitable. Well, it is inevitable, and it has been inevitable for all 50 years since then. And it's still inevitable right now, but inevitable and imminent are not the same thing. And that's the part that always gets left out of the message. So it is absolutely inevitable that we're going to face some kind of currency crisis where, you can look, people always look at the US dollar, Americans particularly, in isolation, and they say, my God, $20 trillion, more than 100% of GDP in national debt. If you look at the unfunded liabilities of the U.S. government and all of the entitlement programs, it's several times that. It's got to give. Any second now, it's got to give. Well, wait a minute. Japan is now and has been for the last 20 years at more than double the debt load in terms of percentage of GDP that the United States is at presently. So Japan was where we are in the United States 20 years ago. Everybody predicted they were going to blow up then, and they didn't blow up. They went into this stagnant state. It's a horrible, horrible place economically to be. They've got worsening demographics. They've got everything just conspiring against them. But it doesn't result in a collapse of the currency overnight the way people wanted to think. It leads to this long-standing stagnation. And that's what happens to important systematically important currencies in the global financial system. So we're not headed toward the US dollar or the euro or anything else blowing up overnight. What we are headed to is potentially some dramatic changes in public policy, which could be extremely inflationary, especially if they involve a lot of public spending on it, more entitlement programs, universal basic income, free college tuition, all that kind of stuff. That's going to be the inflation driver that really creates a speculative opportunity in precious metals. But this whole sky is falling narrative, it's been around and it's been credible. It's really important to give them credit where it's due. It has been a credible story for 50 years now that some kind of blow up is inevitable. It's true, but it doesn't mean it's imminent.
Just taking perhaps a slightly different side of this equation. On the one hand, you have the serious prospect, depending on how one votes politically, of hyperinflation or certainly rampant inflation. But then on the other hand, deflation. Now, I'm going to give you a very easy question because it's essentially for those who've studied it, Economics 101. What is wrong? And we've been asked a number of times, what's wrong with deflation? It means prices are going down. That's better for the consumer. Surely it's better to have an environment of lowering prices than higher prices. What's your take on that?
Well, the answer to that question is really big and involved because I think you have to bring into question the entire fractional reserve banking system. In the fractional reserve banking system, which has been the mechanism through which the global economy offers credit for the last 500 years. Okay, if you don't have fractional reserve banking, you can't have borrowing, and if you don't have borrowing, businesses can't grow and expand and build plants and equipment and so forth. In the fractional reserve banking system that the world has been assuming for the last 500 years is the only option. Under that system, deflation is an absolute killer because it completely destroys the ability of lenders to lend. Once lenders are unable to lend, it means borrowers can't borrow, businesses cannot expand. People who have brilliant ideas and the opportunity to really create employment and prosperity for everyone in the economy are unable to do so because they can't get funding to grow their business. So that's what's wrong with deflation. Now, what if we were to take the next really big step and say, wait a minute, the fractional reserve banking system is more than 500 years old. It's been criticized very heavily by a lot of people. What's missing from this equation is instead of criticizing it and for the gold bugs to stand up on a soapbox and scream at the top of their lungs, that it's the evil bankers that are borrowing, lending money that's not theirs to lend and profiting from everyone else. else, and it's a great injustice, and you can, and I agree with a lot of those sentiments. You can get going on that political grandstanding soapbox for hours and hours, but it doesn't help anything. If we wanted to actually help anything, it would be for someone to step up and say, hey, I've got an idea for how to re-engineer the entire fractional reserve banking system so that we can offer credit in society. We can give businesses the opportunity to grow and expand by having access to growth capital when they need it. But we don't need fractional reserve banking as the mechanism to do it. There's a better way. Well, I believe that the better way comes not in the current cryptocurrencies, which have no mechanisms for fractional reserve or for lending or anything, but I think that digital currency technology, not in its current incarnation, but in the future, will give us the ability to create an entirely new architecture of finance, where we replace the fractional reserve banking system with something much better that's all online and digital, and it gives us an ability to eliminate this idea that there has to be bank reserves in order for banks to be able to loan. If we could eliminate fractional reserve banking and replace it with a better model of delivering credit, then maybe deflation wouldn't be such a bad thing. But in the fractional reserve system, deflation is absolute killer.
On that specific point, one of the sort of critical comments of having a gold-backed currency, whether it be a digital currency or a physical currency, is that, of course, you can only grow that currency at the rate at which, arguably, gold is dug out of the ground, arguably. If that extraction is 1%, 2%, 3% per annum, that prohibits an economy from growing beyond that. Now, a fully mature economy like the United States and many Western civilizations, 3% growth per annum is quite respectable. But if you're an emerging market, for example, you need much higher percentage growths than 3%. So are you not perhaps putting forward the argument that having a go back currency won't actually work if you are a smaller economy based on that?
Well, I don't think that that's necessarily true. It's true that any given economy cannot grow its national debt faster than its GDP growth, because if you do that, you end up devaluing your currency. It's just a mathematical relationship. But as far as the value of money itself, I think that the world, in my opinion, would benefit from more stability. Now, the whole it's fascinating to me that the charter of the Federal Reserve, the United States Central Bank, and certainly the most powerful banking organization in the world, their whole mandate is price stability, the stability of the currency. Yet they state that their interpretation of that mandate is 2% per year inflation, which, by the way, just to put that in perspective, it means that your wealth gets cut in half about once every 15 years in terms of purchasing power. That's how much that inflation digs into it. They consider that to be the ideal achievement of price stability. Well, how could they possibly think that a system in which everyone's wealth gets cut in half every 15 years is equitable price stability? The answer is, if you live in this religion of fractional reserve banking, you really do need a little bit of inflation in the system in order to keep the wheels greased and keep the system going the way they want it to. And it means that everybody's savings are debased in a invisible way that most people don't even perceive as happening to them. I think that's an injustice that could be corrected, but it's a major change. Replacing fractional reserve banking is something that has, it's such a big thing. We replace global reserve currencies every 100 years or so. We've never replaced the fractional reserve banking system. Ever since it was invented, it has been at the center of the whole system. Replacing that with something better is a scale of change which is just staggering. And I think that digital currency technology maybe is going to be the thing that offers so much benefit that it's worth taking on that change. But it will take decades to get there. And I'm not talking cryptocurrency. I'm talking what comes next after cryptocurrency.
Right, I'm wearing my tinfoil hat now, Eric.
Okay.
Okay, wait for this. Wait for this. The Rothschild will not allow you to move away from a fractional reserve banking system. The bankers of the world will not allow any society to get rid of the one thing that has made it and its peers the mega wealthy oligarchs of today's society. What's your answer to that?
Well, the first answer is they're right. That's exactly true. Throughout history, the fractional reserve banking system has maintained a monopoly over the entire global economy, and it does profit the most elite bankers who understand and are at the center of the system the most, and particularly in the offshore creation of dollars in the Eurodollar system. A lot of these guys are just creating ledger entries, and they effectively create assets out of thin air that they could sell for real money. So it is absolutely true that those entrenched interests have that much at stake and should not want to allow society to escape their grasp, so to speak. It's true. The question in my mind is look at what the internet has done to traditional media. It used to be that almost everyone's opinion was shaped by the evening news. And the Rupert Murdochs of the world who controlled that narrative basically controlled public opinion, even though they didn't want to admit to it. It was true. Uh, Look at the internet and alternative media and how podcasts like yours are enlightening people to things that they never would have seen previously. I think that digital currency technology potentially is going to have the wherewithal to and it may not, I'm not a cryptocurrency guy. It's not about oh boy Bitcoin forever. I don't think that's going anywhere other than Bitcoin deserves a place next to the Wright Flyer in the Smithsonian Museum because it's that important of an invention. But just as we don't fly Wright Flyers anymore, we're not going to use Bitcoin 20 years from now. Bitcoin was going to be remembered as where the digital currency revolution started. I think that revolution that happens over the next 20 to 30 years has the potential to replace the 500-year-old reserve currency, I'm sorry, fractional reserve banking system with something much better. Now, unfortunately, that also means there's the risk of sleazy, underhanded, cunning people creating something much worse using the latest digital technology in order to cement their own interests. And that could be the greedy interests of the bankers, or it could be the Orwellian oversight desires of the most extreme people in government who would like to create a currency system which is the exact opposite of what Bitcoin set out to do, something where the government has the ability to control and oversee every single transaction that occurs on Earth. So there's all kinds of opportunities and risks, but my prediction is the next 20 years are going to be a very interesting period in monetary history where major systems get replaced and new things get introduced. And I won't be at all surprised if the US dollar's hegemony over the system is at bare minimum challenged seriously, if not actually replaced by something else.
Quite a few times you've mentioned 2030, 20 years' time, sometime a little distant into the future. I would agree with that, save for one thing. Most of the pumpers are claiming imminent collapse, but we have seen coming out from the shadows the likes of Jim Rogers, as opposed to Jim Rickards, who used to work with Soros and is quite well regarded as a successful investor. Even Ray Dalio of Bridgewater, the largest hedge fund in the world, people who one would normally sort of deem as being relatively having their feet relatively firm on the ground, they are now starting to come out and saying, look, we may very well have a crash and it could be quite soon, even perhaps 2 or 3 years away. Now, we don't care what the pumpers say because, as we've already established, it's tomorrow, regardless, wherever tomorrow is. But these guys are actually expressing serious concerns, and Jim has said that this will be the worst crash ever seen in society. Have they caught the conspiracy fear mongering bug, or are they wrong, or should we perhaps be concerned that these relative moderates are so concerned themselves?
Well, I think Jim Rogers, who's a super guy, I've interviewed him on Macro Voices a few times, is he's absolutely right. But if you listen carefully to what Jim says, he says, "Look, I don't know if it's this year or next year or the next year. I can tell you that the pressure that's built up in the system is creating this, is setting the stage for an epic crisis, and I couldn't agree more with Jim about that. But let's tell all of Jim's story. Jim has been very clear in saying that doesn't mean that it starts tomorrow. It doesn't mean it starts next week. It doesn't mean that I am smart enough to know when it starts. I'm telling you that when we get to a tipping point, it's going to be scary, and I couldn't agree more with that. Now, what I think is unlike a lot of previous examples in monetary history that people like to cite, where they're saying, well, look at what happened in terms of the buildup in, accumulated debt in Brazilian real that led to such and such a crisis on such and such a date. I don't think it's economic triggers. I think it's more political and populist triggers. If you want to know, okay, when does the Jim Rogers event start? The Jim Rogers financial crisis that's worse than any other in recorded history. When does it start? It starts when the yellow vest movement just boils over and reaches the point where it goes viral. It's the whole world. Everybody's pissed off, and it's just, we're not going to take it anymore. And unfortunately, the people who are not going to take it anymore won't know what the right, just solution is. So they won't be able to say, we demand this, and this reform because that's what society needs. Instead, they'll say, we're fed up, we're throwing Molotov cocktails and burning shit down until we get a change that we're satisfied with. And that puts us in a period of history that gets really, really dicey. Hopefully, we come out a better society on the other end of it. What happens in between is going to be really scary. And I think that's what Jim is talking about, and he's right. If you want to know when it starts, pay close attention to the 2020 election in the United States. Watch particularly for, how civilized are the voters on either side of this going to be. If we can somehow get through this next election with civilized discourse where people who disagree very, very strongly on what the priorities of the nation and who the next president should be and so forth can speak to their neighbors respectfully and value one another's right to their own opinions, okay, then it's going to be a while before we have any real crisis. If what happens is people are out with baseball bats attacking people, trying to prevent them from voting using brute force, that's when it's time to say, okay, the shit's getting real. It's time to really, really be worried about what happens to the financial system, because these geopolitical drivers are going to be the catalysts that tip the boat over. So watch the yellow vest movement, watch the U.S. elections, watch the Italy situation in Europe. Watch those things to be your indicators for when the financial collapse that Jim is talking about starts. And he's right. When it starts, it's going to be really ugly. But a lot of people, have been wrong since 2009, saying, okay, this whole, central bank enabled stock market rally. All they're doing is they're papering over our problems with printed money. That was a good argument when I first made it in the summer of 2009. At the time, I said, we're never going to get through the end of this year, to the end of 2009. Well, now we're in the middle of 2019, 10 years later, and it hasn't blown up yet. So, I was right in 2009 when I said they haven't solved any problem that led to this crisis. All they're doing is using the central bank's ability to expand its balance sheet to paper over our problems and extend and pretend, delay the onset of the eventual worst crisis by creating money out of thin air that can be used to prop up financial markets. Well, that's what's been happening. It's been working for 10 years. Maybe it goes another 5 years before it all blows up. The longer it goes, the higher the climb, the harder they fall. It's going to be ugly. But I don't know. Jim Rogers, I'm sure, would admit that he doesn't know when it all falls apart. And I think that what you have to look most skeptically at is the people who claim to know that they're sure it's all going to start in the next 6 months. Nobody has that information.
That's very fair indeed. So on the political front, but I'd like to focus then just very briefly then on gold, silver, stock markets and so forth. But on the political front, is this not what Steve Bannon is all about? Creating discontent. He's traveling around Europe now, trying to foment some degree of anti-establishment resistance. Um, he ultimately, or arguably, is interlinked with the likes of Nigel Farage in the United Kingdom, who we know is paid by Fox News as a commentator, and is has met a number of times with right wing activists. And he has now just set up a brand new party in the United Kingdom called Brexit, because obviously that's the major political move situation currently in the UK. Are these people agents provocateurs, or do you think that perhaps they will actually prove to be heroes of an anti-establishment society?
I think that it's impossible to say who will emerge as eventual leaders. It's clear that these people are are able to see the handwriting on the wall. They know we're headed into a time when populist uprising is going to be the defining characterization of the 2020s. When we look, 100 years from now, when we look back at the 2020s, it's going to be remembered as the time of populist uprising and major changes in society in reaction to that. These are all people who are trying to get a piece of that pie, and they're not sure what it means yet. So they're vying to be part of the story without knowing what the story is going to be. I think you have to just watch it and see how it plays out. But I do think that major changes are coming, and it's very likely to create a period of financial turbulence, which will be a very important time to hedge your currency exposures with precious metals.
Okay, stock markets. Everyone thought a few months ago stock markets were going to collapse, but they've recovered. Uh, the Fed was hell bent on raising interest rates. It's now admitted that it's probably reached its zenith. It still tries to pretend there might be one more rise, but certainly not this year. And the general consensus is that QE of some sort will be ultimately reintroduced in order, as you've already said, to paper over the cracks and to extend this period before this Armageddon situation actually occurs. Can the stock market go much higher? Do you see it going much higher? How do you see the dollar reacting? And then ultimately, of course, because of the general inverse relationship between the price of gold and silver and the dollar, what's going to happen there? What's your sort of best guess over the next year, 2 years, 3 years?
Well, first of all, just in this last past week, we've seen a very important technical breakout on the dollar index and likewise a breakdown in the euro compared to the dollar. And I think that it probably has legs, and it's not about the dollar is, just a wonderful currency and everybody loves the United States and just can't get enough of U.S. foreign policy. That's not what's driving it. What's driving it is the breakdown of the offshore eurodollar system, creating a U.S. dollar liquidity squeeze where there's just not enough dollars to meet international demands because the dollar is still the global reserve currency. And I think that is going to potentially create a serious headwind for gold and silver in coming months. And I think that this move in the dollar could be really big. And if you have the right attitude about investing, you love downside in prices of assets that you like because it's a buying opportunity. What you don't want to do is go all in here thinking, this argument for gold and silver is so strong, I just can't get enough of it. I've got to back the leverage truck up and go out on margin to have 200% of my net worth invested in gold. That's not the move to make here. The move to make, I think, is to have some exposure as a hedge to precious metals, but leave plenty of dry powder to buy a lot more gold and silver at much lower prices if the U.S. dollar rally, which I think is probably going to have legs and take us at least back to 104, maybe to 110 or even higher, maybe even a new all-time high on the dollar index. That has got to create a headwind for gold and silver. Now, there's a couple of things to watch there. One is could lead to much lower prices, which is a buying opportunity. The other possibility, though, is we get to the point where both the dollar and gold are outperforming at the same time. So the usual inverse correlation breaks down and they both move up in price expressed in US dollars at the same time. How is that possible? It's possible because they're both acting as a risk hedge, where people see the dollar and gold as safety assets as other things start to disintegrate. So if you were to see, for example, that the yellow vest movement really escalates, it goes all across Europe, and all of heaven forbid, I hope to be, this is not a prediction, but hypothetically, if you had all of the cities across Europe in as bad or worse condition as what Paris is facing right now with this yellow vest situation, that potentially results in so much fear about just societal instability generally that both gold and the dollar start to outperform at the same time, and there's a breakdown in the usual correlation. So you could see dollar strength there. That's something to pay attention to, but I think that the most likely scenario is the dollar strength leads to a buying opportunity at much lower gold prices, and I don't think 1,000 is out of the question as a gold target if the dollar really takes off as I predict it to. So I think that there's a lot of possibilities for what could come next. But as far as stock market and dollar are concerned, stock market could continue to outperform. And you got to realize, why is it outperforming? It's because the whole market has gotten completely accustomed to this new doctrine of bad is the new good. Literally, when we get bad economic news, what's going on is the Fed is recognizing that the weakness in the stock market is real. We're getting recession signals. The bond yields are telling us that the U.S. is very, very likely to fall into deep recession by the end of 2020. And that's causing weakness in stock markets. The Fed is responding and saying, we concur. There's bad news here. We have to respond. Well, what's the market conditioned to? Anytime the Fed responds to bad news with accommodative policy, it has resulted in the stock market going up for the last 10 years. So as market participants see the Fed responding to bad news with accommodative policy, they're bidding stock prices up. That's to be expected. Well, what happens when we get to the point where the Fed realizes, wait a minute, we've taken the Fed funds rate, not just one cut, but we go several cuts, and we got the Fed funds rate back down to zero, and we still are not able to arrest the economic situation from deteriorating. Oh boy, okay, now we have to consider more quantitative easing. Well, the benefits of quantitative easing, there's a law of diminishing returns there. The more you expand the balance sheet, the less effective each dollar of new debt is. Well, what happens? One scenario is the Fed, the so-called the Fed is out of bullets scenario, which says the Fed runs out of ability to be accommodative and they can't do as much as they want, and all of a sudden the market perceives that Fed put is no longer there, and you get a sudden crash in the stock market. We could be headed toward that. Some people think that's coming. Certainly, if it was coming, you wouldn't expect the market to go down from here. You'd expect it to go up first, and for that up to suddenly be interrupted when there's some oh my gosh moment, which hasn't happened yet. There's another scenario, though, which I worry much more about, and that's the one where the market is assuming the Fed's got their back. If the stock market starts to crash, we know the Fed's going to bail us out. They always do. Okay, what happens when that is proven to be right? The Fed says, "Yep, well, it's time. We got to bail the stock market out," even though we claim that's not our policy. That's what we're going to do because that's what we always do. So we're announcing a new round of quantitative easing, and then you've got Bernie Sanders shoulder to shoulder with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Nancy Pelosi has maybe even decided to be friends with them, and they're all saying, "Look, this business of bailing out Wall Street at the expense of the people has to stop. If we're going to conjure money out of thin air through this magic of central bank balance sheet expansion, then we're going to do it for the benefit of the working class American citizen, not for the benefit of Wall Street bankers. And the way we're going to do that is universal basic income, free college tuition, blah, 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 so on and so forth." What I think you could get to is this oh my gosh moment where the stock market correctly anticipates the Fed governor's intention to bail them out, and the Fed governors are unable to take that action because there's a populist uprising. The people say, hell no, we won't go. We're not going to allow this to happen. We insist that the next Fed easing experience be in the favor of the people. And I think that this could become a major 2020 election issue where whoever is the Democratic or even Democratic Socialist candidate is saying, look, what we need to do is appoint the MMTers. Dr. Stephanie Kelton should be the next Federal Reserve chairman or chairwoman, as the case may be, in order that we can adopt modern monetary theory as the official monetary policy of the Federal Reserve. That's what we need to get to so that there can be free college tuition for everybody, so that there can be universal basic income, so on and so forth. When the market says, holy cow, these people are winning, this is really happening. They're not going to bail us out anymore. Any more government money is going to go to help the people who actually deserve it, not us Wall Street guys. That's when you get the potential for an outright market crash. And I think that moment is very likely coming.
And what about silver, Eric? We've focused on gold. What about silver? Gold to silver ratio 85 to 1.
Cert-
We have argued to some extent that's because the general consensus has been that the world economy are slowing down. The industrial demand for silver, which originally was very close to 60% of its physical demand, has dropped. And therefore, silver isn't just a monetary metal, it's an industrial metal, and therefore it's been adversely affected as a result of that. But there must be more to it than that. How high can this GSR go?
Certainly on a historic level at 85 to 1, it's already pushing extremes. But as Jeff Christian has pointed out, there have been other times in history where people were freaking out at 80 to 1 silver gold ratio, and it went to 100 to 1 from there. So, what are the reasons that that could happen again? I think that at least right now, you're still at a price on silver where you're not up against cash cost of production actually shutting in mines. When you get to that point, I think that the dynamics change dramatically, and there is a salvation point for silver that may not exist for gold as we get down to cash cost numbers. So let's describe hypothetically. Suppose that I'm right about the US dollar and we're going to see a real headwind for gold and silver, and we get down to the point of $950 gold prices, and who knows what the equivalent is on silver. Well, at $950 gold prices, you're really up against the cash cost of production, not the break-even cost of production, but the number at which the operating silver mines and gold mines of the world say, look, if at $950 gold, we're actually better off to leave our metal in the ground, shut down, stop spending electricity and wages on taking it out of the ground, and wait for better prices someday in the future. That magic number for gold is around $900 to $950. Now, in the gold market, what happens is a lot of people assume, okay, that's the magic floor. It can't go any lower than that, because if you get to those kind of numbers, it means that the gold mines all shut down. Well, it might mean that the gold mines shut down, and certainly that is catastrophic for gold mining shares. So if you see that coming, you want to think about whether or not that leverage you gain from gold mining shares over physical metal is really a good idea or not. But when you get to that point, what happens is all of the gold that's ever been produced is still owned by somebody. Gold doesn't get consumed the way industrial metals do. Somebody's still got it, and if the dollar is on a tear, and there are a number of factors in the economy that are creating this headwind for gold prices, gold can in fact continue to trade well below that cash cost of production. And the reason is people still have it and it's not being consumed. The amount of gold that actually gets consumed and used up so it doesn't exist anymore is very, very low. Silver is a different beast. So when silver gets down to its cash cost of production, and I have to admit, I don't even know what that number is, um, when you get to the point.
Sorry, Eric, it does depend on the type of mine. If it's a pure silver mine, I think they're all in sustaining costs are around 13, but then their cash costs are something closer to 10. But of course, if you're talking about the remaining 70% of the market that's focusing on other metals, I've seen figures down to $5, $6 for cash cost. But that's not the average. I think the average is closer towards 7, potentially 8, with of course the all-in sustaining cost then being higher than that because of the other factors it takes into account. But I have seen some companies claiming $5 to $6 an ounce. Sorry to
So
interrupt. Yeah.
no, it's great. I appreciate the information. I think that the point that that really drives home is it's important to understand that as we get down into the cash cost area, which I think could be coming if I'm right about the US dollar, it means that your analysis process for how you look at gold and how you look at silver are completely different. There's no gold getting consumed and used up. It's not the same equation. Silver does get consumed and used up. So you've got to look at, okay, how strong are the people that are holding that silver? How likely are they to give up on their positions as a result of underperformance and dump them onto the market? And if they're not, if they're buying because they correctly realize that we're at generational low prices and it's a good buying opportunity, how long can prices stay at those levels before you get some kind of reaction? Now, the whole streaming model of silver mining, where, as you said, a lot of the silver doesn't come from silver mines. It comes from mines that have to stay in production in order to produce other essentially needed commodities. So they're going to keep on mining copper, and there's going to be those copper mines have a little bit of silver that somebody has bought an interest in that's going to continue to be streamed off of them. That's going to happen as long as we need copper. So, your analysis of what happens at these lower prices and how it affects supply and demand gets much more complicated, and it's a different story for gold than it is for silver. I don't profess to be an expert on that level. If you look, CPM Group tends to do a lot of research that gets that technically detailed, but they only do it when we get into those market conditions. I think they're coming, but we're not there yet. And I should mention too, I think last I saw from CPM Group, they're not on the same page I am about the gold going down from here with strong dollar. I think they're actually more bullish than I am, which is unusual. So we'll see what happens.
Well, what I can say, because I pulled out my calculator quickly, if you have an 85 GSR and that continues, if that does continue, then 950 gold is $11 silver as a rough guide. So obviously, depending how the GSR works for that. We believe our analysis is we can see silver potentially going down to 13, maybe even $12. We doubt it will go much lower. Jim Rogers has said he will buy gold, or believes he will buy gold when it hits that 1,000 or falls below the $1,000 figure. So your 900 to 950 would fit very nicely with what Jim Rogers has been claiming, which is great news. Eric, you've given us 1 hour and at least 12 or 13 minutes of your very precious time. And this has been a wonderful debate, and we could go on for hours and hours and hours on this, which obviously we're not able to do. However, we do want to cover a few questions for our Inner Sanctum members. So therefore, just to bring the if you like, the public video to or podcast to a close, I'd like to thank you for your valuable contribution. Those who wish to follow you, and you've mentioned you have a book, if you could name that book, and we'll put a link obviously below this video. Where can they find you? Because you have your own podcast. And then before you actually depart, if you want our listeners to take away even just one point from today's discussion, what would it be?
Well, why don't I start with the one point? The one point is we're at a time in history between now and 2030 where major things in the world will change. Now, I'm not smart enough to predict that that necessarily means gold prices are going to, X number of thousands of dollars an ounce. I don't know that, but it's a very important time to watch geopolitical developments, and I think it's a very likely time that there will be outperformance of precious metals. But it doesn't just mean buy now and expect the price direction to be one way up. It means understand the world around you, which is very complex and changing rapidly. A great way to do that is to do the first thing you asked me, which is where to follow me. Macrovoices.com, M-A-C-R-O voices.com is where my website and podcast are located. Macro Voices is a weekly podcast where we try to focus on professional investors and very sophisticated retail investors. We talk about a lot of topics that are more advanced than most investing podcasts get into. And we're just launching this week Macro Voices Premium, which is a bunch of new content. There's a new All Stars podcast. There's another podcast that's entirely about energy markets. It's going to launch in a couple of weeks. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on there. And on the same website at macrovoices.com/BB for Beyond Blockchain, which is the name of my book, you can find all the information for where you can order from Amazon the hard copy book. You can order the Kindle version, or there's an audio book that are all available at macrovoices.com/BB. And the book is all about how I think digital currency has the potential to change this whole landscape. And it's very likely that gold and silver will play a role in that happening, because I think that the most likely way for a digital currency to be successful is if it's backed by hard assets, and logically gold is the best choice for that.
Erik, that's tremendous. Thank you very much. We hope that perhaps sometime in the future you will come back, where perhaps certain events will have unfolded then, and we can perhaps compare them to your predictions, or even perhaps discuss further and go into more depth some of the geopolitical activity that will certainly we shall all witness during the 2020 election. Erik, thank you so much. And now we'll move into the Inner Sanctum area. Much obliged to you.
My pleasure.
So there we have it. The dollar is likely to lose its status as the world reserve currency, but the issue is when. Unlikely to be as quick as the pumpers claim, and political and populist action triggers may indeed be the catalyst for this to occur. The new currency may be in the form of a digital, though not necessarily a cryptocurrency. Before that happens, we may very well see a prolonged period of stagnation and the reintroduction of quantitative easing. Gold and silver are a strong long-term monetary value protection, and there may even be a windfall in holding it, though Erik suspects prices may fall first before they begin that ascent. However, nothing is ruled out. We are indeed most grateful for Erik undertaking this interview, and part 3 will be available only within the Inner Sanctum for bronze and silver members, where we shall discuss more precise levels of gold and silver prices to come, plus other precious metals and investment considerations. So if you are a bronze or silver member, then please log into the Inner Sanctum on our website from tomorrow afternoon, where the podcast shall be available under the section entitled Premium Videos. We have listed Erik's links below for his Macro Voices podcasts, and where you may obtain copies of his book Beyond Blockchain, in hard copy as well as digital format. Next month, we shall have another, hopefully equally as riveting interview. Stay tuned as to whom it may be. We hope you have found this video interesting and informative, and if so, please give it a thumbs up and share it on social media. Please ensure that you have subscribed to our channel and press the bell sign so that you are notified of any future videos. Also, kindly visit our website at illuminatisilver.com, and if you haven't already done so, please subscribe either as a free or paying member for regular email updates and offers. Disclaimer: Illuminati Silver owners come from a background of banking, international wealth management and economics. Having now retired from these worlds, we are not qualified to give investment advice. Therefore, this and other productions must not be deemed to be giving such advice and merely represent the personal views of its owners.